The First Middle East War. The current heated Israel-Hamas war continues to spill over. On the night of April 13, 2024, Iran launched more than 200 unmanned drones, ballistic missiles, and cruise missiles at Israel from its own territory. In response to such an exaggerated retaliatory action, the reaction of people on Earth is inevitably, will it trigger the Sixth Middle East War? Seizing this opportunity, let us review the previous Middle East wars. Let's explore whether there is an inevitable connection through unraveling the threads and distinguishing truth from falsehood. In the year 70 AD, in Jerusalem, the Jews launched a long-planned armed uprising aimed at overthrowing the colonial rule of the Roman Empire. After the brutal and bloody suppression of the uprising, almost all remaining Jews were expelled from the region of Palestine by the Roman authorities. Since then, the Jews have entered the epic period of the Great Diaspora, which lasted for more than 1800 years. During this long journey, the Jews have been wandering and displaced from generation to generation, but they have always maintained a steadfast commitment to their ancestral culture and religious traditions, as well as a longing for the Promised Land. In modern Europe, Jews were despised, marginalized, abused, and massacred everywhere. Therefore, Jews longed even more to have a place of their own. Thus, Zionism, also known as Jewish nationalism, emerged. Jews sold their properties, raised funds, and then risked everything, at any cost, to rush back to the ancient land of their ancestors, Palestine, now known as Israel. The movement of Jews returning to their homeland first received generous support from wealthy Jewish financiers overseas, travel fees, settlement fees, land purchase fees, and so on. Otherwise, relying solely on the efforts of individual Jews who had already spent all their wealth, for many people, it would have been nothing but a fleeting dream and an illusion. The plight of the Jews throughout history is evident in the following couplets.
Exodus from Egypt. The first return. Wandering in the wilderness for nearly 40 years, the great Exodus. The second return. Wandering across the world for nearly 2,000 years.
After the First World War, Britain and France took over large territories from the defeated Ottoman Turkey Empire. They claimed to be administering these territories temporarily. Among them, the region of Palestine was assigned to Britain. Therefore, for Jews to return to Palestine, they had to pass through the British Mandate authorities first. At that time, the Palestine region had already been inhabited by new residents for thousands of years. They were a pan-Arabic people, Arabs of mixed descent, commonly referred to as Palestinians. They empathized with the plight of their Jewish brothers in Europe and were willing to extend warm hands to welcome Jewish refugees elegantly to settle and prosper. However, as the number of Jewish immigrants continued to increase, Palestinians became increasingly wary, fearing that Jews would rise in dominance and eventually take over. Unfortunately, this concern was not unfounded. Jews soon established several political organizations. It was obvious that they intended to take over. These active Jewish organizations engaged in intelligence warfare with the British Mandate authorities and fought bravely with the local Palestinians. Their goal was to seize every opportunity to carve out a piece of blue sky and white clouds for themselves. However, as hatred intensified, the situation spiraled out of control and extremism became inevitable. Thus, the Zionist movement inadvertently invented modern terrorism. In other words, the progenitor of modern terrorism in the Middle East is the Zionist movement. Faced with this unsolvable problem, The British authorities were overwhelmed but powerless. Eventually, they chose to shift the burden to the newly established United Nations, which was only 2 years old. Unexpectedly, the United Nations readily accepted the responsibility. At that time, the United Nations Special Committee proposed 2 solutions to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict for discussion. 1. Unified statehood, establish a federal state unified by Palestinians and Jews. 2. Partition of Palestine, establish separate states for Palestinians and Jews. The United Nations ultimately chose the Partition of Palestine plan. This is the famous United Nations Security Council Resolution 181 in history. This resolution allowed Israel and Palestine to each establish their own states on the land of Palestine. 1. Israel, with 1/3 of the local population, received 55% of the land share. Despite including large swathes of the southern Negev desert, most Jews were still willing to accept it with joy. 2. Palestine, with 2/3 of the local population, only received 45% of the land share, divided into 3 disjointed enclaves. Arabs naturally could not accept this. It would be difficult for anyone else to accept it either. 3. The capital, Jerusalem, was placed under the administration of the United Nations. Both Israel and Palestine lost their coveted capital. In fact, this arbitration was detrimental to both Israel and Palestine. However, 1. For Israel, it was better than nothing. After all, their people had been wandering for nearly 2,000 years. At present, as long as they could establish their own country independently, they would be satisfied. Because once a country is established, they have the capital to live and thrive, laying the foundation for great ambitions and national rejuvenation. Everything else is trivial and can be discussed later. 2. For Palestine, it was a guilty verdict, dividing their original home in half and giving half to others. This violent way of splitting up a family is akin to punishing a defeated country, similar to post-World War II Germany, where the territory and capital were carved up and occupied by 4 victorious countries. However, Palestine's situation was even worse than Germany's. After all, if we talk about enclaves, the distance is too close, not worth flying. By land, one still needs to pass through Israel and obtain a visa. Moreover, each trip requires processing immigration procedures twice. In terms of losses to Palestinians, they lost because 1. They had lived for generations without ever establishing a country. If a country had been established first, the story of Jewish immigration would not have occurred. 2. Palestinians were scattered and lacked authoritative organization to represent the will of the people in diplomatic and political affairs. 3. Since Palestine had not established a country, it did not have a regular army. In this Arab-Israeli war, the Arab League's 5-country coalition simultaneously attacked Israel, not out of invitation from Palestine or to stand up for their Palestinian brothers. Instead, they used the pretext of sacrificing for the sake of Palestine to divide Palestinian land and achieve Arabization of the region. The specific plan was 1. Southern Palestine, to be given to Egypt. 2. Central Palestine, to be given to Jordan. 3. Northern Palestine, to be given to Syria. If the Arab League's coalition succeeded, Israel and Palestine would cease to exist. This was the most ideal form of pan-Arabism. Only Islamic culture would exist in the greater Arab region. This laid a solid foundation for ultimately realizing the unity of the Arab world. This is a purely ethnic war, not a religious war. Officially, it's indeed difficult to find traces of a religious war. However, both warring parties belong to single religious ethnicities, so it's not realistic to completely exclude religion from the war. For example, 1. During the war, Jewish immigrant planes never stopped flying. 2. After landing, the first thing Jewish immigrants did was kiss the land of their ancestors. The second thing was to pick up weapons. The third thing was to rush to the battlefield. 3. Jews of all ages, men and women alike, who were capable of carrying guns, all armed themselves. They could stand guard, keep watch, check roads, handle logistics, supply, and escort prisoners, among other support tasks. This kind of spontaneous universal mobilization pattern undoubtedly involves the role of religion. The Arab League, united in attacking Israel, was actually fighting a gentleman's war. They neither wanted to exterminate the Jews nor to drive them into global wandering again. They only wanted to establish a state in Palestine primarily for Palestinians, where Jews could be a minority group, even with autonomy. But the Jews didn't see it that way. Because no matter how many times they won in war, as long as they lost once, it meant the extinction of their race. Moreover, the most important thing was their belief in the prophecies of the Bible and the blessing of God. After all, this was the promised land. So, the Jews had confidence in victory. The re-establishment of Israel had biblical prophecies to support it. The Bible made prophecies about the re-establishment of Israel over 2,000 years ago. Deuteronomy prophesied that they would be tossed among all the nations of the world. Ezekiel, written around 580 BC, in chapters 36 and 37, said that God promised the Israelites that they would revive from desolation, rekindle from ashes, and become one nation. The intermittent Arab-Israeli wars lasted for decades. Israel often emerged victorious. Thus, some said that one Israeli soldier could defeat 10 Arab soldiers. However, some scholars didn't agree. 1. Israeli soldiers could fight because they had no strategic depth, and each battle was a desperate fight, a fight to the death. Therefore, they always fought with the belief that they were going to die. All their troops were elites, desperate fighters, daredevils. So, the energy they burst forth with often surpassed that of ordinary people. 2. Arab soldiers couldn't fight because they fought a rational civilized battle. If they could fight, they fought. If they couldn't, they ran. They never risked their lives, never broke themselves. After all, the soft fears the hard, and the hard fears the reckless. So, when they encountered the reckless Israeli army, to survive was the greatest victory. If the Arab League established a unified regime, it would inevitably become a pole in the world. This certainly didn't conform to the international new order formed after World War II, led by the US and the USSR, with Europe as a secondary player, with East and West confronting each other. So, the mainstream international society would definitely stab the Arab world in the back in secret. And Israel was such a ready-made, ideal knife. As long as there was Israel, the sharp and bloodied knife, it was the ace in the hole and the hanging Damocles sword over the Arab world. Thus, the Arabs would always need the support of the international community, and dare not speak or act recklessly. In this sense, the Arabs' open war against Israel was also a shadow war against the international community. In 1947, when the UN voted on Resolution 181, Arab countries collectively voted against it, even protested by leaving their seats, and publicly declared, as long as Israel was established, they would go to war. In 1948, on the pretext of the expiration of the British Mandate, the British authorities completely withdrew from Palestine. On the same day, in Tel Aviv, Israeli Prime Minister Ben-Gurion convened a mass rally and officially declared the establishment of the state. Sure enough, the next day, the 5 major Arab League countries, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, simultaneously launched an attack on Israel. The coalition came prepared, with overwhelming momentum, catching Israeli militias off guard and defeating them in a landslide. Seeing the newborn Israel about to be strangled in the cradle, the international community couldn't sit still. On the 3rd day of the war, major powers proposed a ceasefire at the United Nations and vigorously supported Israel. 1. The United States urged all available aircraft to provide blood transfusions and oxygen for Israel, refuel, and cheer them on. 2. The Soviet Union transferred a large amount of military supplies from Czechoslovakia to Israel. At the same time, both the US and Soviet camps imposed arms embargoes on the Arab side. They also pressured Britain to withdraw its military advisors embedded in Arab armies. As a result, seeing the almost dying Israel miraculously revived after the ceasefire, from a dying sick cat to a huge, bloodthirsty tiger in almost an instant, the battlefield situation reversed rapidly. The coalition retreated step by step, only able to defend but not counterattack. In the end, the Arabs admitted defeat, signed, and withdrew their troops. The defeat of the Arab countries, strategically speaking, does not require self-blame. 1. Dealing with the small Israeli militia was more than enough. 2. Challenging the vast international community behind them left them with the desire, but not the ability. However, tactically, the defeat of the Arab countries must be examined. 1. Underestimation of the enemy. They rushed into battle without establishing a unified command, resulting in a mere symbolic coalition. Each country's troops acted independently, fighting their own battles, lacking coordination and tactics. 2. Outdated equipment. They mostly used outdated weapons from World War I era against Israel's modern weaponry from World War II. With such operations, defeat was inevitable. Especially during the ceasefire, Israel massively imported advanced weapons such as fighter jets, tanks, and artillery. Meanwhile, Arab countries only managed to acquire some outdated Mauser rifles from the European black market. 3. Reluctance to engage in direct combat. While Israel continuously reinforced its troops, starting from around 30,000 initially to 115,000 later, the Arab coalition maintained a relatively constant force of around 40,000 to 50,000 soldiers throughout the conflict. The timeline of the war progressed as follows. Phase 1. On May 15, 1948, the British withdrew, and Israel declared independence. The next morning, the Arab League's 7-member coalition mobilized and launched an offensive against Israel. Led by the 5 major Arab countries, they deployed approximately 25,000 troops, with overwhelming weaponry advantage. At this time, there was almost a unanimous international belief that Israel would be defeated within 2 weeks. Israel initially had 30,000 militia members, later reinforced continuously. With the advantage of fighting on their own turf and a nationwide mobilization, Israel had a significant manpower advantage. Additionally, Jewish people from around the world were returning to Israel every day due to favorable international conditions. Moreover, Israel had a slight edge in terms of experienced veterans who had fought in World War II. The most intense battles occurred in Jerusalem and along the road connecting Jerusalem to Tel Aviv. The fierce fighting was against the Arab Legion. After intense street battles, the Israeli forces were eventually driven out of the Arab areas of Jerusalem and the Jewish quarter of the Old City. In the north, the war was almost a farce. Syrian armored units faced staunch resistance and were even stopped by Jewish militia armed only with light weapons. Later, Jewish militias assembled a makeshift artillery piece from parts found in 19th-century museums. Intimidated by its power, the Syrian army retreated. Subsequently, the Syrian lines were continuously counterattacked, as were other coalition forces and Palestinian guerrilla units. In the south, the Egyptian army managed to breach some Israeli defenses, but suffered heavy losses. Shortly after, the Israeli forces stabilized and launched a counterattack, expanding the war into Egyptian territory. First ceasefire. The United Nations declared a ceasefire agreement effective on June 11, lasting for 4 weeks. During this period, both sides were subjected to an arms embargo. During the ceasefire, the Arab side not only failed to receive more weapons, but also experienced internal disputes among member states. In contrast, Israel violated the ceasefire and managed to acquire a large number of weapons through the black market, including from Czechoslovakia. On July 8, Egypt resumed hostilities. Phase 2. On July 9, 1948, benefiting from the ceasefire, the Israeli forces were fully charged and launched a 10-day counteroffensive against the Arab coalition. The coalition was surprised and unable to respond effectively due to lack of unified command, being on the defensive from the beginning. In the northern front, the Israeli counterattack was successful. On July 15 to 16, Israeli forces launched nighttime raids and captured the towns of Safed and Nazareth, thus seizing the entire Galilee region. Second ceasefire and Phase 3. On July 18, 1948, the United Nations announced the second ceasefire, lasting for 3 months. By October 15, the Israeli forces launched another major counteroffensive, while the coalition switched to a full defensive posture. The Israeli forces conducted 3 large-scale focused attacks. The most crucial one was the occupation of the cities of Lod and Ramla to secure a safe passage between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. After capturing these cities, Israel expelled 50,000 Palestinian residents, marking the largest displacement of the war. The second phase of the Israeli plan was to capture Lat-Run and Ramallah, overlooking Jerusalem, followed by the next objective. On January 7, 1949, Egypt requested a ceasefire, and Israel agreed. Thus, both parties entered ceasefire negotiations. Transjordan signed a ceasefire agreement with Israel on March 2, while Iraq refused to negotiate with Israel, but complied with the Transjordan-Israel agreement. With this, the First Arab-Israeli War came to an end. Casualties and losses. Israeli casualties included 4,000 soldiers and 2,400 civilians, while the Arab coalition's casualties ranged from 5,000 to 15,000. The most aggrieved loser in this war was Palestine, despite UN Resolution 181 leaving them with half the land. they lost it all after the war. Israel occupied 80%, Egypt took Gaza, and Jordan occupied the west bank of the Jordan River. Consequently, nearly 1 million displaced Palestinians had to flee their homes, becoming international beggars. Their sentiments might include
cursing the Jews for their treachery, complaining about unreliable allies.
Arabs felt aggrieved, believing that Israel had covert support, making their victory unfair. They vowed to seek revenge and reclaim their lost dignity and interests. Israelis were jubilant, seeing divine intervention as safeguarding their nation and securing the promised land. As for seizing more Palestinian territory, Israelis considered it war reparations, a common practice throughout history and international norms. The war lasted 15 months. Eventually, all parties, exhausted and unwilling, had to sign a ceasefire agreement. However, this agreement only meant an indefinite cessation of hostilities, not a peace treaty. The ceasefire line did not become the border. Therefore, another eruption of violence was only a matter of time. Reflections. Arab League, attacking Israel. Not to eliminate the Jewish people, but to eliminate the Jewish state, to lay a solid foundation for a pan-Arab unified nation. Israel, counterattacking. Not to eliminate the Arab coalition, but to safeguard their own territory. However, controversy remains regarding the outcome, whether it was justified defense or excessive defense. United States, favoring Israel. Not due to blood ties, but because of influential Jewish financial and political elites whose existence influences American politics to a considerable extent. United Nations, intervening in the Arab-Israeli conflict. Not to grab attention or political capital, but to seize the rare opportunity to address the root cause of Arab unity and statehood. Launching a war undermines UN resolutions. Indeed, the Arab defeat was due to internal disunity. If the Arabs had already unified into one country, the outcome would have been uncertain. International community, reflecting on the Arab-Israeli conflict. Better for the Arabs and Israelis to quarrel behind closed doors, as their disputes may escalate and disturb innocent neighbors. After all, they are brothers, so it's best to resolve their conflicts peacefully. Therefore, reflecting on the love-hate relationship between Palestinians and Israelis, perhaps there's still a chance for rational resolution if we could turn back time to the beginning. Hence, here's a whimsical poem to express these thoughts. Quatrain: The Establishment of Israel.
Establishing Israel was no easy feat. Brothers quarreled over the sandy plot. One day, they'll put down their arms in peace, toasting to endless talks, never to stop.